On this episode, I have Joshua Erickson back on to continue our series on the Jewish calendar and feast days. Again, I encourage everyone who has not done so to go back and listen to the first 5 episodes of this series. Today, Joshua and I sit down and have a conversation about Passover. We go through the story of Exodus, then we talk about how the celebration is kept today, and finish up by talking about what we as Mormons can take away from the events of Passover. That's next on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. Because of your generosity last year, I was able to buy better audio equipment and software. I can't tell you how much it meant to me that not only did you spend your time here with me on the podcast, but also that you found enough value in what I'm doing that you donated the podcast to upgrade it. This year, I want to continue to grow. Now, I want to add video to the podcast to continue to help you, my guests, and myself connect better through the show. The other feature I'm working on for this podcast is something I have to remain vague about for now. But what I can say is that it's something that will help us better connect as fundamentalists and traditional LDS folks. Now, to get that equipment for the video content I want to do and to build the infrastructure for the other project with this podcast, donations would certainly be welcome. Or you can go to MormonRenegade.com, click that supply store button, and get some new swag. New stuff will be out soon as well. Now, if you can't afford to do either of those two things, I totally get it. Maybe just keep the podcast in your prayers that we'll be blessed with those resources. Again, thank you for everything you do as well as for listening to the podcast. Here's the unfortunate truth right now. As fundamentalists and traditional LDS folks, we can't expect to have accurate history told by others because true history and scholarship is problematic for certain people and organizations. We're going to have to do this work ourselves, and to do that, we'll have to support each other in this kind of work. Now, anybody who's anybody in fundamentalist circles knows who Drew Briney is. He is perhaps the most prolific author within Mormon fundamentalism. Drew's newest project is something I think all Mormons can benefit from. He is in the process of creating an annotated version of the Doctrine and Covenants. Once you have a copy of this, you'll be able to compare current sections with previous versions and also what early LDS leaders had to say about that particular section. As fundamentalists and traditional LDS folks, we are constantly trying to get back into the minds of the early brethren. This project that Drew is engaged in right now is going to be the ultimate tool to help us do that. Now, because this annotated version of the Doctrine and Covenants is such a massive undertaking, Drew needs some help from others. Drew's plan for getting this annotated version of the Doctrine and Covenants out is through crowdfunding. The link for that will be out April 4th. If you want more details sooner, go to Drew's Facebook page and message him from there, and he'll give you all the details. Further, on Saturday, April 8th, I'll be releasing an episode that talks about this project in greater detail. So please, if you feel impressed to do so and have the means, I'd humbly ask that you reach out to Drew and support this project that will help advance the scholarship and true doctrine of the restored gospel.
You're listening to the Mormon Renegade Podcast.
Dude, we're back again.
Yeah, and got a lot to talk about today.
This is a little heavier than Purim.
Yes, quite a bit heavier, actually. Yeah, Purim is very light and fun and fanciful even, and Passover is heavy stuff. This is angel of death stuff,
right.
Blood on the door stuff, plagues and redemption and all that.
I had a buddy who's an evangelical, but also a big fan of hard rock and heavy metal. Mm-hmm. And he always said, he was like, that episode from Egypt when Moses is there, he's like, that's straight metal. Right? I'm like, that's probably not a bad way of putting it, right? I mean, plagues and everything else. So
I mean, the horror of the whole scene leading up to Passover is horrendous.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and here's the thing. Anytime you enslave a people, it's not going to go well for you.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I would say amen to that.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
tyranny always brings its own reward. Yeah.
Yep.
So, okay. Yeah. So Passover is a big deal, not only for Judaism, but for Christianity, obviously. And Judaism and Christianity both kind of point to various Passovers as the foundation or the beginning of their religion. Of course, Christianity looks at the ancient Israelite Passover as a type and shadow in many ways of the Passover that occurred with Jesus as the Lamb of God, right? And so it really, there's so much of the scriptures that the symbolism in the scriptures that go back to or point back to the Passover and the Exodus, or I suppose you could say the other way around, that so much of the occurrences that happened with the Passover and Exodus actually point forward to gospel things, and also even as do all the feasts, point to future realities that are yet to be fulfilled. So.
And you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. I'm used to being wrong. To me, I always looked at Passover and found it to be unique in the sense that it was both a religious holiday as well as something that I think we could kind of almost equate to 4th of July on our end a little bit, right? This is the birth of a nation.
This is Independence Day.
Yeah.
In a real way, this is Independence Day for the nation of Israel.
Yeah, it's kind of the birth of a nation. I don't know how else to put it.
That is the way to put it. Yeah. This is when Israel Israel is, of course, the name, the additional name given to, the new name given to Jacob, right after he wrestles with the angel, and then he's got his family, his 12 sons, and he's got at least one daughter that's mentioned, and they have children and stuff. But by the time they're ready to leave, when they go down into Egypt, that's kind of a proto nation, right? It's a little, it's the seed of a nation. But by the time they leave Egypt, they're many millions strong, and so it was miraculous on an enormous scale.
And I think also the founders of this country recognize that. I mean, our first seal wasn't the eagle with the arrows. Our first seal was Moses crossing the Red Sea with the children of Israel and Pharaoh's armies being drowned.
Yeah, Independence Day.
So yeah, it was. Yeah, there was this. Okay, I'll give a spoiler. You're going to want to show up to the Torah conference. I'm talking a little bit about this when you're there. But yeah, it was very much the founders saw a lot that they could equate to. And whatever your views are on blacks in the priesthood, I think by now we should all agree slavery is probably not a great thing. At least the slavery that was practiced, for the Africans during antebellum period.
Oh yeah,
because it's not what it describes in the Bible.
There's
right?
no justification for that.
If you look at the Bible, that was indentured servitude with an end date, right?
Yeah,
there was an expiration date there. This was something different, and I've often looked at the Civil War and thought, yeah, we probably paid a price.
Oh, we definitely did. Yeah.
Right? There was a little bit of divine retribution there.
Yeah, amen to that.
So,
okay, where to begin? Exodus is a beginning. Passover is a beginning, as we've been mentioning already. So, Exodus chapter 12. This is before that. In Exodus, we have the story of there being a new Pharaoh who didn't know about Joseph, and the Egyptians are worried about this growing population of Israelites, and how loyal they are to the Egyptian crown, and Pharaoh says to start drowning the male children, right? And of course, we have the story of the valiant midwives, right, who lie to Pharaoh and say, "Oh, we've tried to do your order, but the midwives or the Hebrew women, they're lively and they just give birth before we show up, and so Pharaoh wasn't pleased with that, but the Scripture says that God blessed those midwives. Well, anyway, Pharaoh, of course, decides that if we can't control their population, we'll continue to try to control their population, but we're also going to enslave them as a means of controlling the Israelite population. And of course, then Moses comes into the story, and Moses typifies Christ in so many ways in this story. I mean, the first bit we get about Moses is, going back to the story of Jesus, right? We know the wise men come, and Herod is not happy that there's going to be a new king, right? And so he sends soldiers to go and kill all of the babies. Of course, Joseph and Mary and Jesus, they flee to Egypt for safety.
Ironic.
Yeah, and so here we have, again, actually, I would say a Messiah type figure in Moses, and he actually is going to take the crown essentially from Pharaoh. Pharaoh doesn't know that yet, but yeah, there's a wicked king who tries to kill the babies to get rid of this promised child, but the promised child actually finds refuge in Egypt, actually in Pharaoh's house, right, is where Moses is raised. And at some point, Moses, he's raised as an Egyptian, raised as a prince, but he is out observing the Israelites in their bondage. He sees an Egyptian taskmaster seriously abusing this Israelite man, and he secretly, or he thinks it's secretly, he defends the Israelite man and ends up killing the Egyptian and buries him in the sand and hopes that no one will know about it. But people did find out about it somehow, right? And Moses is afraid that word is going to get out, and word does get out, and so he flees, and he ends up in Midian, which is Midian was one of Abraham's children from Keturah. So he ends up in Midian, ends up in the camp of Jethro, right, who ends up being his father-in-law. Right? And the Midianites, they have next to Jethro's land is a mountain which they call the Mountain of the Lord, which was Sinai or Horeb. And we know the story. Moses sees this. He's tending sheep, and he sees this burning bush, right, which is burning and not being consumed. And this is obviously a curious thing, and he goes there to see what's going on, and the Lord speaks to him from the bush, right, from the fire, and gives him a mission. And Moses is not real happy about that, but God says, "You're the one, and I'll give you, your brother Aaron is there, and he can help too." So
there's so many things about Moses' story that I find fascinating, right? And some of it I can relate to, although I'll never be as good as Moses. But this idea of discovering your parentage, right? Discovering your heritage. And then having that heritage be at odds with the worldly powers of the time. I think that's something we can all relate to at this point, right? As we discover we're of the family of God, there's a reason we don't fit in with the rest of society. Also, I remember when I first became a Mormon, when I joined the LDS Church, I had to leave my hometown because I was trying to quit drinking. And I was at that point where the party found me. I didn't have to go look for it anymore. Yeah. And so I had to remove myself, and I removed myself to an itty-bitty town about 45 minutes away where no one knew me, where I was out in the country. And so there's some parallels there, right?
Oh, yeah. That, what you described there is the Passover story.
Right.
In microcosm.
Yeah. You're removed. And so there was a lot.
Get out of Egypt.
Yeah, there was a lot of Moses' story that I could identify with. And I've often thought, and we'll get to it in a minute, when he has to go back and talk to Pharaoh, that must have been a strange reunion. And I can sympathize a little bit with that because I'll run into guys from time to time when I'm back in Idaho that I screwed around with. And it's a little awkward, right? Because,
yeah, no doubt.
They're like, you want to go grab one? And I'm like, no, I'm not much of a partaker anymore. And I remember one guy goes, what, did you become a Mormon? I'm like, yep.
That's hilarious.
So, yeah, and you can only imagine what it must have been like for Moses to go through all of this, to be so high and be brought low. I think the way Cecil DeMille painted it when Charlton Heston was crossing the desert, where it turns men into prophets, sort of a thing.
Yeah, there's some good movies that have been made.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a type of Christ as well. I mean, really, Moses condescends.
Yeah. From
Egyptian royalty to identifying himself with the slaves.
Yeah.
I'm a Hebrew, he says.
Yeah, he's. I think there's something that we can all take away from Moses' story. It's such an integral story of just not the nation of Israel, not just the Jewish people, not just Mormons or anybody else. I think there's something very intrinsic there.
Yeah.
That we can take from.
Yeah, I mean that's why it's. I mean, the Bible's the oldest book in the world that's still read. And the most widely read ancient book, and there's a reason for that. Yeah, because these stories are everyone's story, right? Yep. And the stories keep unfolding, generation after generation. Yeah, and always will, because there's just truth there that has to do with man's struggle. Yeah, for freedom and for salvation. Yeah,
and it's made an impression to the point that it's in the psyche of every human, I think. Now. Yeah. Right? Yeah, agreed. I had a good friend who was an atheist named Jason, and he once said, so why doesn't God continue to talk out of burning bushes? I said, because if anyone who was religious saw a burning bush, we all know we're going the other direction, because nothing good's coming after that. So.
Amazing. Well, we won't go over too much of the story, but of course, Moses asks for Pharaoh to let them go. Pharaoh says no, then there's a plague, and we just go back and forth with Pharaoh saying, okay, call it off, and then another plague comes along, right? 10 of them, culminating in the final two plagues are darkness, and then death, the slaying of the firstborns. Yeah, and this brings us to Exodus chapter 12, which is, so all of that other stuff was the first part of Exodus. But in Exodus chapter 12, I'll read here. The Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be to you the first month of the year to you. So this is really a beginning. This, not only of their calendar, which it was. This is, of course, Passover is in the spring. And it actually used to be much more widespread, this idea of New Year's being in the spring. Our Roman calendar has switched it to winter, January, but it used to be in the spring. And this is why April 1st is April Fool's Day, because there was a propaganda what's the word I'm looking for? Push to try to get people to stop celebrating New Year in the spring.
Really?
Yeah, and if you did, then you were called April Fool. So
really, I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
Yeah. So anyway, this is going to be the beginning, not only of the calendar, but also the beginning of the nation, like we mentioned already. Now this actually goes way way back before that. Because if you go to Exodus 12, 40 and 41. Now this is after they're, like, the day that they're leaving. Which was, by the way, on the 15th of the month. So I'll back up just a little. Beginning of chapter 12, he says, this is going to be the beginning of the month. This is basically going to be the new year here. So the first day of the first month is going to be the new year. And then later on, we'll talk about it a little more. On the 10th day of this month, they were supposed to pick out a lamb, or a goat to be the Passover. And then the 15th, starting on the 15th and for 7 days, they're going to have the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So, and this timing of the first month actually there's an interesting mirror with the 7th month. We talked about some of the festivals of the 7th month, but on the 7th month, on the first of the month is trumpets, and then on the 10th is Yom Kippur,
right.
And then on the 15th, for 7 days, is the Feast of Tabernacles. So in the first month, we have New Year. On the 10th, we select the lamb. On the 15th, and for a week, we have Festival of Unleavened Bread. And then in the 7th month, we have the first is the Feast of Trumpets, but also called Rosh Hashanah, so the head of the year. It's a kind of a new year as well. And then we have the Day of Atonement on the 10th, and then Tabernacles. And there's this kind of symmetry between the first and the 7th month for good reasons. Right. There's actually a real connection between those. So, of course, Passover is when we left Egypt, but that's like when our redemption was completed. But the redemption began. This is a little bit of Jewish tradition. The redemption began in the 7th month, on Rosh Hashanah, or the Feast of Trumpets. That's when the plagues began. So the tradition is like for 6 months, often there'd be a few days or weeks of plague, and then there would be a little break, and then another days or weeks of plague, for 10 plagues, and then by the time it comes to Passover, which is the 14th, and then 15th is the Day of Unleavened Bread, the first day of Unleavened Bread. Then that's when our redemption is complete, and we actually have freedom. So, okay, all that, though, is to say that this wasn't actually, this is a beginning, but the story of Passover actually begins centuries before that. So, in chapter 12, verse 40, says, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt," and there's actually a corruption in the text there. It should say, "who dwelt in Canaan and Egypt." That's what the Septuagint and some older versions, and in the New Testament, it talks about that too. So anyway, the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Canaan and Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the self same day it came to pass, that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. So, hosts of the Lord, this is, of course, like the Hebrew there is the armies of the Lord. So this is the Lord's army, Israel. Right. So on, to the day, 430 years ago, to the day. Now, what is the day they're talking about? Even the self-same day. That is the day that the Lord commanded Abraham to go to Canaan. And where God said, "I will give you this land." Oh. So that's that goes back to Genesis 12. Okay, so Genesis 12, verse 1. "Now Jehovah had said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing, And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Okay, so there it is, and that promise was repeated to Abraham a few times. But it's interesting because the story of Abraham is actually a microcosm of the Passover again, because Abraham starts out in Canaan. And where does Israel start? They start out in Canaan as well. And then at some point, Abraham goes to Egypt. It says the problem was there was a famine.
Right.
There's a famine, so Abraham goes to Egypt. And he stays there for a little bit, and eventually there's that episode with Pharaoh wanting his wife, right? And Abraham ends up rich because of that mess up there and the little white lie that was told. She's my sister. And then Abraham leaves and goes back to Canaan. Okay, and this is kind of the story of Israel as well, right? Jacob and his 12 sons, they're in Canaan. There's a famine. They go down to Egypt, and they're there for a little while, and eventually they come out with great riches. Yeah. And eventually go back to Canaan. And the Israelites, when they go back to Canaan, then they drive out the inhabitants. Now, the story for Abraham is he goes down, there's a famine, he goes to Egypt, comes out with great riches back, and then he drives out some of the inhabitants too. He has wars with some of the kings around Sodom and Gomorrah, and then of course Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities of the plain are miraculously destroyed. But there's this cleansing of the land for Abraham's sake. Well, you could say for Abraham's sake. So there's this mirror there between the father, who's Abraham, and his posterity, which is Israel.
The other thing that I find fascinating for both Moses and Abraham is this idea of get out of the country. Leave. I'm chopping you off to do something different.
Yeah.
What you're in now is corrupt. You need to be removed if you seek righteousness. And I think that there is something there that I think we all have to wrestle with, which is looking at our current circumstance and go, is it good or is it bad? Well, if it's bad, if it's corrupt, then you gotta leave, right? And I find that
it's corrupt and irreparable.
And irreparable. It's time to leave.
That's right.
Right? It's time to pack up and move. And to me, that is something that takes strength on the part of the person. I understand God's commanding it, but you're not going to get that out of somebody who's just weak or can't think for themselves or something like that. It takes a little bit of guts, right? For lack of a better term. I remember being 24, having 4 kids. The night before I leave for Maryland, I'm laying in my house, a nice house, comfortable house in western Idaho, looking up the ceiling with everything packed up, thinking, what the hell am I doing?
I know. Crazy.
Right? And so I think there's something here where the Lord is saying, even if it's not a physical move, maybe it's a spiritual move. Maybe the current system, you're in, or the current system you have espoused, or the current system you have developed for yourself isn't working, doesn't seem good, is irreparable. It's time to move.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when, and you'll know that too, right?
Yep. Oh, he makes it very clear.
And it's damaging to your soul.
Yep.
To know that you are in a bad place and doing the wrong things, and to do it anyway.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because I think we all have that little bit of light of Christ in us that calls to us and says, you better go. This is not the place for you.
I'm reminded of the kind of the contrast between Abram and his father, Terah. Right? Terah, there's not a lot in Genesis about Terah, but in some of the Midrash, the stories, extra biblical stories, Terah's an idolater. My favorite story is Abram's a young man, and he's trying to figure out. He wants to be God's friend. He wants to know God. He wants to serve God. He wants to find out who the real God is and serve the living God. And his father, Terah, has a room full of idols. And at some point, he comes to realize that like these are all just man-made things. These are made by human hands. So these definitely can't be gods. And so he decides he's going to just chop up all the idols in his father's little idol room, whatever that's called. And he takes a hatchet to all the idols. There's just like, I don't know, dozens and dozens of them, and he chops them all up. And then, except for the biggest one, and he like puts the axe in the biggest idol's hands. And Terah comes home, and he's like, goes to pray or whatever. I don't know, make his offering, and everything is just in splinters. All his idols are just in splinters and shattered stone and whatever. And Abram, what's going on? What's the meaning of this? And Abram says, well, I brought in food to offer to your idols, and when I laid the plate of food down, all of the little gods, they like started to reach out to grab it before the big god was able to take the food, and he got mad and he chopped up all the other ones. And Terah's like, that's ridiculous. Of course he can't do that. He's just wood or stone or whatever. And Abram says, well, then why are we worshiping these? What are we doing? But Terah was a servant of Nimrod. Yeah, he was a part of Nimrod's kingdom and just going along with the society and the government and the religion of his time, and was a coward really, and knew that this was not right, but just kept his head down, and did what was expected and didn't rock the boat, so to speak.
Well, and I think this speaks to where we get ourselves, how we get ourselves into trouble, right? Is I think that it's one of those things where it's like you think about leaving a society, so to speak, and you're like, well, gosh, I got my job, and it's a cushy job, and I'm paid well, and yeah, I got this house, and if I'm not making idols, what am I gonna do, right? And so
I'm good at it.
Yeah, and so I think I think this is one of those things where it really points to us. You better stand on principle at some point, because if you have to make justifications for, well, Lord, you didn't expect me to just leave all that, did you? Well, yeah, he kind of does.
Kind of does. So it gets to the point where there's going to be the final plague, right? The death of the firstborn, and so Jehovah tells Moses, "This is what we're going to do. This is going to be the destruction of Egypt and the redemption of Israel, and anyone who wants to be part of Israel, too." And that was not, by the way, limited to the literal descendants of Jacob only, but when Israel left, it actually specifically says that there was a mixed multitude of people. Gentiles galore, who came along, who were converted to the worship of the living God, by all the things that they had seen, no doubt. But God said basically anyone who wants to survive this last plague, this is what you do: you take your lamb, choose it on the 10th day. On the 14th day, everyone together is going to kill the Passover. By the way, Passover, it's just to get a little terminology here. A lot of times in our everyday speech, when we're talking about Passover, we get the term Passover confused with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And sometimes we'll say that Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread are the same thing. They're actually two different but related things. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is the thing that happens for 7 days, where they eat matzah only, which is the unleavened bread. Passover is also technically not a day. Passover is the lamb.
Okay.
And so when you read the scriptures, it says, kill the Passover on the 14th day. So the Passover is the animal. That's the name of the animal that is killed on the 14th and then is eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs on the evening of the 15th, right? As nightfall comes after the 14th. Then everyone's supposed to be inside. The blood is put on the doorposts, right? And there's just the symbolism is so rich with the Lamb of God, and applying the blood to the door of the house, and basically salvation is inside the house. That's like through the blood. That you have to go enter through the door. You have to enter through the blood of the Lamb to be in the house of Israel, essentially, right, or the houses of Israel,
right,
in order to be spared. So the angel of death comes and says there's not a house that isn't affected, because there's firstborns all over the place.
Right.
And so again, I want to kind of give the broad overview, I guess, here. Finally Pharaoh says, you have to leave. Like, I've been wanting to keep you, but you have to leave, actually. So they gather up all their people, all their flocks. The scriptures say to borrow gold and jewels from their Egyptian neighbors. Their Egyptian neighbors are happy to give them gold and jewels and treasure. In reality, it's not. Of course, Israel leaves with all this stuff. I would not call that theft, though. I think that's just back payment for all of the years of slavery, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, they leave with all of that, and then Pharaoh hardens his heart again, right, and changes his mind and assembles what few chariots he has left, because the animals have been plagued as well, but gathers up what chariots he can and chases them down. The Israelites have had a few days head start, and they're at the Red Sea, right? And Pharaoh meets them there, and of course the army is held back by the pillar of fire until the sea splits, the Red Sea splits, and they go across. And this, on the first day of unleavened bread is when they actually leave Egypt, but then Pharaoh chases them. And then on the seventh day of unleavened bread, which, if you include Passover, which is kind of, Passover is like the day to prepare for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So it's the 8th day since Passover, and then that's when they go through the Red Sea. So that's the scriptures say that the first and last day of unleavened bread are special Sabbaths, where there's supposed to be a holy convocation, it says, or a solemn assembly. And so on that seventh day is when they pass through the Red Sea, and the armies of Pharaoh are destroyed. And this goes, I was going to point, there's so many symbolic things, but one of them that is often kind of forgotten is the fact that the Egyptians represent something, and the Egyptians they represent the people in your life who want to keep you in Egypt.
Right.
And you mentioned this earlier, when you try to leave, there will be people who want to pull you back into those old habits.
Yep.
Into that bondage of whatever sort it is, spiritual or bondage or addictions or bad relationships or sins of all sorts. But that's a real part of the story too. So.
There's a lot of symbolism just in that little bit we went through, or things that we can take away. Obviously, the blood of the Lamb is a big one. But there's little ones, too, that pop out at you. When you talk about having, killing the lambs, these are slaves, okay, that are there, the Israelites at that time. They're huddled together close We know that because of some things, oral tradition and whatnot. It wasn't like the slaves were allowed to spread out. They the Egyptians wanted them in one place so they could have their eye on them. Mm-hmm. Goshen was a huge one. They don't have room for livestock. So if they have a lamb, that lamb it's precious. It's almost a pet.
Yeah.
Now, I want to paint this picture because the Lord's trying to teach something here. This is an animal that your kids have played with. This is an animal that has probably become kind of like a dog, right? I love my dog. When everything else is down, my dog is always there, right? Always happy to see me, right? And then you're going to kill that lamb.
Yeah.
You're going to see your father kill that lamb.
Right.
I had to put a dog down just over a year ago that we had for 13 years.
I bet you bawled like a baby.
I bawled like a little girl. I have no other way to say it. That tore me up worse than I thought it would.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
it's surprising.
It is surprising
when you're faced with that.
Yeah, and
emotion involved.
Yeah, and now all of a sudden it takes on a different feel when you realize that these people had that animal. That animal was kind of a part of the family at that point. And then to watch your father, or maybe you have to go do it, there's some symbolism there. Likewise, with the gold and the silver and the jewels that are taken out of Egypt, I think we can draw from that this idea of there's things that we can take out of the world that aren't inherently evil, mm-hmm. and then use them for
Put them
good.
To use, yeah.
Now,
like
the same gold that was used that was taken from the Egyptians, I shouldn't say taken, but because from oral tradition that I've read, and I could be wrong, Joshua, the Egyptians are almost throwing it at them, right? Like, take it and go, just get out. Here's all your gold, whatever you need, just go. So they're throwing it at them. That same gold can be used to put the trim around the tabernacle on the Ark of the Covenant, and it can also be used to make a golden calf.
That's right. That's fair. Yeah.
So there's some symbolism there. The other is later on in the story of the Israelites, when they get to Canaan and they got to go to war, and I'd never thought about this till my buddy brought it up. He's like, "Where do you think they got the weapons for war?" And I'm like, "I don't know." He's like, "They were picking them up off the seashore from the Egyptians,
washing them up." Yeah, that maybe so. I like that.
And so the symbolism here is rich and deep, and there's so much we can take away from this if we spend some time really reading the story and not just reading it, but immersing ourselves in it and thinking about it.
Yeah, beautiful stuff. I mean, the story of Passover in the Exodus just has so many layers, and they just pile up on top of one another. It's almost hard to, we're just going to scratch the surface in this little meeting here.
Yep.
So I do want to, now that we've kind of laid the groundwork, and most people are kind of familiar with the basics of the story, but
thanks, Charlton Heston.
I know. I think Mormons can have kind of a special appreciation of the symbolic meaning of this story, because of our kind of view of the plan of salvation. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to lay this out just in brief, but there's all kinds of details that we could pick out there. So the story, as I mentioned, it starts out with Abraham, and he is the father of the faithful. That's one of Abraham's names, and then he has a son, and he has a son. So it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and these are the three patriarchs. Okay, and Jacob actually becomes the people of Israel. Okay, so then when we're talking about the Mormon idea of the plan of salvation, it all starts with these three. It starts with our Father. It starts with Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Okay, and of course the middle one is the one that's sacrificed, right? And so with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's that is the case as well. And also, and this is a kind of a uniquely Mormon thing, is that the story of the plan of salvation doesn't start on earth; it actually starts in heaven. Okay, so but the story of Israel starts in Canaan, which is the promised land, which is symbolic of heaven.
Right.
Okay, and then so we all start in Israel starts in the promised land, and then they go down to Egypt, which is the world.
Right.
And everything's good at first, right? And when we come to the earth, everything's good at first because we're innocent and we're not accountable. But at some point, sin enters in, right? The bondage of sin, I will say, and then there's all that goes along with that, and then eventually there's a savior provided, and then on there's a savior provided in the Passover story. There was the lamb. Okay, we leave the world behind. We leave the Egyptians behind. They don't want us to leave. They want to keep us in sin. We come to, but we put our faith in the Savior, in the Lamb, and then we come to this point where we have faith. So we put the blood on our house, and we repent. We're like, we're not going to build up Egypt anymore. We're going to do what God wants us to do. That's repentance.
Right.
Okay, and we're going to go out into the wilderness, and then that prepares us for baptism, and that is the Red Sea, right? Israel, as a nation, which in the scriptures is often referred to as a person, like Israel as a body,
right,
is sometimes referred to as God's son, sometimes referred to as God's servant, sometimes as God's wife. Just depending on the metaphor that's being used, but as a corporate body, we go underneath the water, right? And this is on the 8th day, too, right? So the number 8 is connected to baptism, right?
Okay.
In lots of stories, 8 Jaredite barges and eight people on Noah's ship, and so on. So we go under the water, and then there's a pillar of fire that guides us, and this is the Holy Ghost, right? And then we go out into the wilderness, and there's a period of purification, right? So after we're baptized, the scriptures would refer to this as like justification, but then there's a period of sanctification where we become holy. Now, in the story of Israel, it's the old generation dying off bit by bit and being replaced by the new generation, who then is finally worthy to enter heaven again, enter the promised land. And so there's this cool thing, right, where we start in heaven, we descend to earth, go through all these trials and plagues, and eventually escape, and there's baptism, and then there's all this sanctification, and then ultimately we end up back in the same place where we began. And the other cool thing about it is that, and I mentioned this earlier, is that Abraham, who is symbolic of the father here,
right?
Earlier in the story, he actually did all that stuff first before, right? Abraham does this stuff.
Yeah.
Starts out in Canaan, goes down to Egypt, and returns to Canaan, and goes through all the struggles and things, and then his descendants make the same. Trace his footsteps, so to speak. So there's a lot of details that could be pulled out there.
Yeah, and what I find funny is that this story continues to cycle through, in time after time. Right? You can see it in this story that we're talking about. You can see it in the colonists that were here for religious freedom, right? We're going to break away. We're going to go do something different. And then you see it again with in 3 or 4 generations after them, where we're breaking from England. And then let's make it really Mormon. Now Brigham's going to take the saints out of the United States and break away again.
Mormon Moses.
Right, exactly. And so this story I would imagine that we're going to see another episode of this, only maybe not so physical, right? Maybe now it's a matter of spiritually coming out of Egypt, right? Whatever your Egypt is, there's this idea now of coming out of it. Maybe it's shutting off the social media. Maybe it's, just finding a way to leave Egypt or Babylon behind you and go forward.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts going through my mind, but yeah, it's part of it is the truth of knowing what it is you're supporting. I mean, in one sense, they were slaves, yes. Okay, and so I don't know how much. We can't necessarily blame individual Israelites for that, but in another sense, like we sell ourselves into slavery, right?
Yep.
It's like, okay, we'll go along with that, and before you know it, you're actually building up Egypt.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think part of the plagues is to get Pharaoh's attention, but part of it's probably to get the Israelites' attention too. To be like, hey, you see this beautiful Nile? They probably maybe they loved the Nile. They took pride in this awesome river that was in their country.
At least the giver of life.
Yeah.
Through there, right? I mean, you're probably drawing your water from there and wells associated with it.
Here it is.
Yep.
I'm going to turn it to blood. All the fish are going to die. It's going to stink. And then frogs are going to come out. And all the things that, at some point, all the things that you thought maybe were kind of cool or nice about Egypt, and they did think Egypt was nice. They complained to Moses over and over. Let's go back. In Egypt we had cucumbers and leeks to eat. And at least we were, at least the Egyptians fed us. And it's like, wow, it's selling your birthright for a mess of pottage.
Yep.
Like you would trade your freedom for some cucumbers.
Well, and I think it's actually deeper than that. So I've thought about this a little bit once when we adopted our twins, we had to become foster parents first.
Yeah.
Which was just asinine, right? I have 4 kids who are doing well because of my wife. I'm not going to lie. It wasn't.
No doubt.
It had nothing to do with me. But anyway, they're doing good, and I'm taking a class on parenting from somebody who's never had kids.
Ugh.
Drove me nuts.
No doubt.
Right? But I played the game. One day I was getting ready to head out of that class. I mean, I'd go to that class, I'm like, I can't wait to get out of here, right? I would be watching the clock, and I'm like, I'm out. One day I get caught. I was talking to another guy, and the lady who was teaching the class came up and said, hey, I was wondering if you would go with us, because I'm a pretty big guy, right? Mm-hmm. We have to do what they called an extraction.
Okay.
From a house. And the city police department was fairly thin. And she's like, they've assured us that it's safe, but I would like some help. There's going to be one other cop there. And I'm like,
okay,
fine. Right? So I get in there.
Let's do this.
And we drive down there. And it's just horrible conditions, Joshua. There's no food in the house. There's moldy food in the house. There is feces on the wall.
Filth and squalor.
It's filth and squalor. And you can tell these kids have been abused. Like, having been a former smoker, I know what a cigarette butt burn looks like. And those kids had them. It was horrific. Horrific. Made me want to pound somebody. I was like, where is he? I got something I want to give him. And what struck me is even when we were telling the kids, we're going to take you someplace safer. You're going to be able to go someplace where there's good food. They fought. They were like, I can't leave here. I got to stay here. I got to stay here. This is where I'm at. And there's this human condition that we get in where the fear of the unknown seems worse than whatever condition you're in now. And I think that we can take that lesson away, that sometimes the unknown is way better
Oh yeah.
than what's here.
The devil you know is better than the devil.
Yeah,
you don't.
I don't necessarily ascribe to that in most cases. I think, well, maybe not, right? and I think
Right.
I think that's the Lord saying, don't be too scared of change. Change is inevitable.
So yeah. So I think part of the plagues was God just had to destroy Egypt.
Yeah.
So it's not appealing anymore because it's just hail and fire and all
He did his
like let's just destroy this place so that my people are not going to feel a desire to stay.
right.
Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, I mean that happens. Their world fell apart, and they experienced a lot of the plagues too. Not all of them, but the first few, the Israelites and the Egyptians felt equally. Right. So there's, and there's a lesson in that too. Like God's people are not guaranteed to have an easy time at it when the plagues and the destruction come. Like you're going to feel it too, but ultimate destruction. There's a promise there that ultimate destruction you will pass over you, right? So, yeah. So, let's see. So now there's kind of three kind of closely related festivals or important days surrounding Passover. There's the Passover itself, which is, as I mentioned before, is the lamb actually, and the lamb or the goat is killed on the 14th, and then beginning on the 15th and going for 7 days, we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And why unleavened bread? To remind them of the haste with which they left Egypt. Right? They couldn't wait for their bread to rise, and so they baked this flatbread. And then the other thing is This didn't happen when they first left Egypt, but later on in Leviticus, like in Leviticus 23, it talks about the first fruits offering, and this is the first fruits of the barley. So in the land of Israel, the barley becomes ripe at about the time of Passover, a little before. And the rule that God gave is when the barley starts to become ripe, no one can eat, you're not supposed to eat the new grain until the first offering has been made to God. And then you can partake of the bread after that. So, and that first day of first fruits, actually, there are different traditions about this, and we can talk about that a little bit, but it's connected with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I'll just say that. The most common tradition, which is the tradition that the rabbis take, is that the day when the first sheaf of barley is supposed to be offered is the second day of unleavened bread. Okay. The Karaites, which is another branch of Judaism, they feel like that it's going to be basically the Sunday during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, whenever that. It doesn't.
Okay.
It could be the first or the second, third, fourth, fifth, or sixth or seventh day. But when there's going to be a Sunday in there somewhere, it'll be the day after the weekly Sabbath, basically. And in ancient times, these two views were basically the Pharisees and the Sadducees disagreed.
Of course, it is
And the Sadducees were of the opinion that the first fruit offering mentioned in Leviticus 23 should be during the Sunday, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Pharisees said no, it should be the second day of unleavened bread, whenever that is. Okay. So fast forwarding now to Jesus and his fulfillment. Of course, there's so many things that Jesus fulfilled. He's referred to as the Lamb of God, and over throughout the scriptures, when it talks about a lamb, like in the book of Revelation, there's this lamb that talks about, and it's referring to this Passover imagery. Okay, so there's all kinds of things that actually the celebration of Passover and the different kind of rituals, they talk about Jesus' triumphant entry. They talk about his cleansing of the temple. They foreshadow him as the Passover lamb, the significance of the Lord's Supper or the sacrament. The Passover rituals foreshadow the place and time of his crucifixion. They foreshadow those responsible for his death. There's foreshadowing of the 3 days in the tomb, and also the time of his resurrection. So all of those things are fulfilled in detail by Jesus and his Passion Week, basically. So first one is the triumphant entry. So this, and you can read, this is in John, in the Gospels. Matthew and Mark talk about it too, but this is when Jesus comes riding into Jerusalem on the donkey, and everyone's shouting Hosanna, and they've got the palm branches, and they're throwing down their jackets or whatever to make a path for him, and they hail him as king,
right?
Essentially, and this at this point, like until. This really is this setting. Jesus gets set apart from the rest of the Israelites. He's been mingling with them. He's been mingling with the lowlifes, right? The tax collectors, the prostitutes, and the sinners. But now suddenly he's gaining traction. He's gaining popularity, and he suddenly gets elevated to king, essentially. I mean, it's symbolically speaking, they recognize him as that, and the leadership has been nervous about him.
Oh yeah,
but they're like, no, we definitely got to take care of this problem. This is embarrassing, right? And this happens. John gives the timing. This happens on the 10th day of Passover, or 10th day of the first month. This is when the Passover lambs are set apart from the rest of the flock as the sacrificial lamb. Mm-hmm. So here he is, set apart on his with the triumphal entry. So Jesus, of course, cleanses the temple too. Okay, he makes a whip, and it's a great story for all those people who have the big teddy bear, loving, accepting Jesus, right? That wouldn't hurt a flea or whatever, right? But he takes the time to braid a whip, and then goes in and flips over the tables and cleans house.
Yep.
And this is fulfilling the Passover symbolism as well, because in preparation for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they're supposed to clean their houses of all the chametz, or the leaven. So here he is. He says, "I'm cleaning my Father's house," right, of the wickedness that's there. And of course, leaven in the Scriptures has a number of meanings, but generally, not always, but generally, there's kind of a negative connotation. Like,
right.
Leaven is representative of sin of some sort, or false ideas. At least, like Jesus says, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees."
Right.
Right. Now, it's not always negative, but usually it is. Jesus also says to his followers, "A little leaven leavens the whole lump." Like he wants us to be the leaven for the world, but
right.
But with the righteous counterpart to the leaven of the Pharisees and the wicked. These uninspired traditions that the Pharisees are constantly trying to pile on to everybody. And Jesus, he gets criticized for not following their traditions all the time, even though he's sinless. He's keeping all the commandments, but he does not keep their traditions. He picks some food on the Sabbath and heals people on the Sabbath, his disciples eat with unwashed hands, and he's being criticized constantly. But all these things that he's being criticized about, none of them are actual commandments.
Right.
These are, otherwise he's not sinless, right? They're all the traditions of the Pharisees, which he says, beware of this leavening that they have. So there's some corruption in the temple too, and who knows what all that entails. I've heard the theories about, people bring animals and the priests were maybe saying, we found this problem with your lamb that you brought, so why don't we have some here though that you can buy from us that are certified or whatever, and they were kind of abusing the system.
They turned it into a money-making operation.
Yeah, Jesus didn't like that.
No.
So he cleaned the leaven out of his father's house. Then, of course, he is the lamb. The scriptures are full of that. And he's not only is he the lamb, but he's the lamb that was slain from before the foundation of the world, or from the foundation of the world. So this was always the plan. And time and place of his crucifixion. Now, in Exodus chapter 12, when Jehovah is giving instructions, he tells them to, on the 14th, he says you're supposed to kill the Passover lambs in the afternoon. The Hebrew phrase is between the evenings.
Okay. So
in the Hebrew way of thinking about the day, there's actually 2 evenings, and we actually in our English modern speech, we refer to these things as evenings too. The first evening is noon, and when the sun reaches its high place and then starts to go down, that's evening. And of course we say PM. That's right. Evening, right? But then there's also the evening where the sun is actually getting close to the horizon, and the sky turns red and it starts to get dimmer. We call that evening as well, and so did ancient Israelites. So between the evenings is the phrase used. So that was in the afternoon. And typically the Passover lambs were killed between like 3 and 5 p.m. And in the Gospels it says that is the time that Jesus was crucified to.
Wow.
Right then, when at the temple all of the Passover lambs were being killed, Jesus at that same time was being flogged and then nailed to the cross, and all of those horrible things. So he fulfilled that. Now, there is kind of an interesting glitch in the Gospels, and that is the Synoptic Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all say that the Last Supper, or they don't necessarily say, but they imply very strongly that the Last Supper was the Passover. However, John says that it was before the Passover. And which I agree with John, because if Jesus had kind of eaten the Passover and then been killed the following day, he would have not have been the Passover lamb. Right. I think it's more important for him to be the Passover than to keep the Passover, right? And actually in Luke he says, I have desired with great desire to eat this Passover, but I'm not going to partake again until the kingdom of God comes, basically. So anyway, there's some things we probably won't get into it, but there's looking at the Greek construction of the sentences in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It actually can be translated a couple of different ways, and I think the better translation is, rather than at some point it says on the first day of unleavened bread, the better translation is it actually says before the feast of unleavened bread. They were making preparations. So anyway, that's just a little side note, but I do think Jesus was, he was crucified when the lambs were being slaughtered. Yeah. Okay. So those responsible for his death too. The Passover rituals actually tell us about that too, and it's really tempting sometimes to point to the Romans, say, those dirty Romans, they're the ones that killed Jesus, or even to say, the Jews, especially the corrupt Jewish leadership, they're the ones that killed Jesus. But you know who kills the Passover?
It's the actual people of Israel when they allow Barabbas to go free.
Yeah. The people. Yeah.
Yep.
The people do that. And that's what in Exodus chapter 12 he says, the father of every house, you are gonna kill the lamb. And it is by them and for them that the lamb is killed. And that's a humbling thing to think about. Actually, I think about that sometimes when when I'm doing the sacrament with my family or fellowship or whatever. We partake of the bread and the wine in remembrance of Jesus, but the guys who are administering
right
are the ones who are ripping flesh, right? Yeah, this is me. This is my sins. Every time I tear it, I just think of my sins, and this is what I did to my Savior,
Yep.
And his blood was poured out because of me.
Yep.
And for me. And it was not the Romans who shed his blood. That was me.
Yep.
So
I think there's also an interesting parallel there too, that we know that there was a large faction of Israel that wasn't happy that Rome was there.
Yeah.
Right? And rightfully so. I
Yeah.
don't think any of us would be happy with an occupying power.
Very few.
Having said that, because of political strifes, they were so angry they preferred a murderer over somebody else. And I think that can be kind of a cautionary tale as well. Right? And I get some flack for this. I liked Trump as a president. I thought he did some good stuff. I was a huge fan when he moved the embassy to Jerusalem. Right. I'm like, I didn't see that coming. So I definitely didn't vote for Hillary, but I did write in another candidate. I did write in Ted Cruz because I just didn't think Trump was a constitutionalist. I was wrong. I'll admit that. He was better than I thought he was. The one thing that scared me about Trump was that he appealed to everybody's anger.
Oh, absolutely.
And that, to me, is always troubling. And I think you see parallels in that with what happened with Barabbas and Jesus, right?
Yeah.
People are so angry that they're being occupied.
We want not Jesus.
Right. They weren't looking.
It doesn't matter.
Right.
Not
just
Jesus.
Anybody to make the Romans' lives harder.
Yeah,
and we know that Barabbas, he was one of the zealots, right? He was one of those hanging out down by the Galilee, performing guerrilla tactics and that sort of thing. Because let's face it, if he's murdering other Jews, the Jewish people probably are more like, yeah, you keep him. Yeah, we'll take Jesus. Barabbas is killing, quote, the right people. And so that political anger can be somewhat blinding. And I think it's a cautionary tale to be very careful who you're pinning to.
Yeah, no. That blinding is the right word. Yeah.
Yeah. When you let your anger dictate a lot of your decisions, you can do a lot of silly crap when you're angry. And that was my only knock.
And it's not only and it's the anger of a crowd too.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's that mob mentality.
Yeah. You've seen those those motivational posters. Like it's got
Right. Yeah.
this eagle soaring or whatever.
Or the cat hanging on that says "hang in there." Yeah.
Hang in there, and excellence and persevere and all that. There's a company. There's probably a few companies that make not motivational posters, but demotivational.
I've seen those. Those are awesome.
They're hilarious. My favorite one though is it's pictures of all these hands, like in the middle, like we're gonna do a go team kind of thing. But the caption is like, I think the caption says teamwork, but then the subtitle is none of us is as dumb as all of us.
Yeah. Yep.
So, yeah. I mean, it's easy.
There's so many great symbolisms within the Passover, and when you start looking at what happens to Jesus, it's good stuff.
Yeah, it's the best. So, okay, his time in the tomb and the time of his resurrection. This is really cool too, because Paul, the Apostle Paul, he picks up on this in his writings, and he refers to Jesus as the first fruits of them that slept.
Okay.
And this is talking about the first fruits of the barley harvest, and equating that to the resurrection. And Paul has plenty of imagery about this. But as I said, and this happens during Passover, and it happens on, as I said, the Sadducees felt like it should always be on a Sunday. And the Pharisees thought it should be the second day, and sometimes those were the same. And the year that, and I love this too about Jesus, is that I think the year that he died, those were actually
the same day.
So it actually satisfied both calendar systems. Okay, but basically Jesus is the first sheaf of the resurrection, or the first fruits of the resurrection. So, and what that means is no one else can partake of the resurrection until that first sheaf is offered.
Right.
Okay? And Jesus says that to Mary in the garden. He says, "Don't hold me." Some of the translations say "don't touch me," but that's not what he was intending, I don't believe. It says "don't hold me," as in don't hold me back. I need to go present myself to the Father, right, as that first sheaf of the resurrection. And then once that is done, then other folks can partake of the resurrection too.
Gotcha.
So that was fulfilled there as well. So really amazing stuff. Now, how is it celebrated? These things. Well, the modern celebration really is in a Seder. So Seder, Passover Seder, is a Seder means an ordered meal. Mm-hmm. So they have this symbolic meal, and there's kind of these parts. It's kind of like a play almost, and the father will say something, and then the family will say something, and then the children will say something, and there's kind of a script that you read, and in a lot of ways, the Seder is very much like the endowment.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that, actually, I'm gonna read. Let's see if I wrote it down. Let's see. Well, it's in Exodus 13 somewhere. Okay. So one of the commandments connected to Passover is that you're supposed to teach this to your children.
Right.
Forever. And you're supposed to do these things and keep this as a memorial forever. That's how important it is. So in Exodus 13, starting at verse 14, let's see, actually. Okay. Yeah, no, I'm going to start at verse 8. So, just before that, he's talking about 7 days of unleavened bread. And verse 8 says, "And thou shalt show thy son in that day, saying, And by the way, I'm going to back up to 5. Sorry.
No,
Exodus
you're good.
13, verse 5. It says, when the Lord shall bring thee into the land. Okay, so when the Lord brings them into the land, was there anyone who was brought into the land who actually experienced what happened in Egypt?
No, because all the old generation died off in the wanderings.
No one except Joshua and Caleb.
Yep.
That's it. So, but even though none of the people there who will be brought into the land actually experienced it, this is the commandment that they're given. It's really amazing. And thou shalt show thy son in that day, saying, this is done because of that which Jehovah did unto me when I came forth out of Egypt. Mm-hmm. See, so even nowadays, like you are, the commandment is that when you have your family sitting around the table and you're eating unleavened bread and lamb and bitter herbs, and you tell the story, you're supposed to tell your children, this is what God did for me when I came out of Egypt. And every generation is supposed to tell, this is what God did for me when he took me out of Egypt. Throughout your generations. Because one, our ancestor's story is our story.
Yep.
And two, this is a, and we've mentioned it several times, this is a personal story that gets told over and over. In the endowment it says, each of you is supposed to consider yourselves as though you were Adam and Eve, right? We weren't Adam and Eve, and yet we are Adam and Eve, and this is a story about us. And we are learning, we are taking upon ourselves the identity of our ancestors, and going through the things that they went through and learning about the things that they experienced, in hopes that we can have the blessings that they had, right? And so when the Seder meal is done and we tell the story and we go through this ceremonial reenactment of that night, each of you is to consider yourselves as though you were there in Egypt, right? And you were freed, and you tell your children, this is what God did for me personally.
That's one of the things I love about Mormonism, is that you can always tell where God has been, because he leaves an impression that lasts for generations, and preceding generations hearken back to it. We do this with our youth, right? And this will ring true especially in the LDS Church. How many times have they went back
Trek.
and reenacted Trek, right?
Yeah,
Why would you do that? It's the same thing. It is, God was in the details of that. How do I know? Because his impression is so defined that we now have successive generations
Echoes through the generations
going back to reenact those things, to have an appreciation, to have that experience. It's the same thing he did with the Jewish nation, with Israel. Reenact this. It's just like he went through it. It's just like the endowment.
That's exactly
because you're going to pass through what the ultimate ancestor passed through to get here.
That's right. Yeah, it's like I'm reminded of Lectures on Faith. I think it's 6 or 7. I can't remember now, but it's basically like, you want the blessings that your ancestors had,
Mm-hmm.
you do what they did.
Yep.
And it is vain for you to think that you can have the same blessing without the same sacrifice. You do what they did, you'll get the blessing they got. And that's it. That's the rule.
And I think it's also a fulfillment of that promise where, the hearts will be turned to the fathers, and the hearts of the children shall be turned to their fathers, and their fathers to their children.
Yeah.
I think that is very much a part of that, because what better way to have your heart turned to your ancestors than to do as they did, to experience what they experienced. And if I'm not mistaken, the Seder meal has some pretty bitter herbs. You're going to recoil at the experience just like your ancestors did.
That's right. Yeah, it's beautiful. Beautiful, but that like welding link between the generations is built into the commandments surrounding the observance of Passover. So, now there's so the Seder, like I said, the Seder is found in a book called the Haggadah. The Haggadah means the telling. So this contains, and I'm holding one here for those of you who can't see, but the Haggadah contains the story of Passover, which they're commanded to tell, and also kind of the instructions for the meal.
Right.
And it involves these symbolic elements. The main, the symbolic elements that are required by the scriptures are lamb, unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs. And you mentioned the bitter herbs can be many things, but traditionally that involves horseradish. And the tradition with that is that you're supposed to take like the size of an olive, and it's uncomfortable, right? And it's supposed to be. It's supposed to bring you to tears,
Yep.
And it does. Okay. Now there are additional symbolic elements that have been added over time, and that includes like washing of hands. There's a couple of times where this is done, and eating this mixture called haroset, which is basically made from fruits and nuts and juice or wine kind of boiled together into a paste. And this is to remind them of like the mortar that they made bricks with and stuff. Okay. And there's also these cups of wine. The tradition is 4 cups of wine at various points throughout the meal. So a little side note on that, by the way. I don't know if have you seen Don Bradley's book, The Lost 116 Pages?
I've seen it. I've never read it.
Excellent book. Highly recommend it. He has some really interesting historical background that has been dug up about the contents of the lost pages. And at least one of the interesting details that's lost is that at the time when Lehi and his family make their exodus from Jerusalem, it is during this festival of the Jews. And there's good evidence that that Lehi probably left during Passover. And the fact that Nephi found Laban drunk in the streets probably is because he was out. He had more than 4 cups of wine. But anyway, it was probably connected with Passover. And there's a lot of actually Passover imagery kind of in the exodus of Lehi and his family. So there's a little Mormon, another Mormon connection there. So anyway, the Seder is interesting because nobody actually knows who wrote the Seder. There's many different kind of versions that have come up over the years, but we know that it's about 2,000 years old, at least. Interesting, though.
Just a smidge.
Yeah. Interesting, though, is many things in Christianity and Mormonism included have, either I will say continued or borrowed symbolism and elements from Judaism. But the exchange has gone the other way too, and there's actually very good. There's some good evidence that the Jewish Seder actually was a response to the Christian celebration of Passover, because the Last Supper, which although it was not a Passover, definitely had Passover significance, right? And so in the Seder there's washing of hands. In the Last Supper there's washing of feet. There is the bread. There's the wine, right, which is in the Seder too. There's Jesus dipping his bread into some sort of dip, the sop, it says, right? And of course, Judas dips with him,
right?
But in the Seder, there's the haroset. Like I said, they actually dip into the haroset, and also there's salt water that's vegetables are dipped in at another time. But so there's all these, and there's several cups actually of wine. In the Last Supper, there's cups mentioned throughout the Synoptic Gospels. So anyway, the oldest account of any historical account that we have of anything that looks like a Seder is actually the Last Supper. And so this actually is has its roots there, right. I believe. So, forgot what I was going to say. So, anyway, the Seder's great. We usually have. I know what I was going to say. So there is some controversy about whether or not you should have lamb in modern times. So, rabbinic Jews, they definitely frown upon eating lamb during the Seder, and a big part of that is because they have no temple.
No absence of a temple. Yeah.
Right. And they say there are some verses in Deuteronomy that, if you read it one way, seems to say that that the Passover needs to be killed at the temple. Oh. And in second temple times, like in Jesus' day, that is kind of the practice. At least for the people who were living in Jerusalem, they would bring their lambs to the temple to kill them and then take them home and eat them. But I don't want to get into the details there. But this is in Deuteronomy 16, anyway, I think Deuteronomy 16 is actually describing the national celebration of Passover versus the individual familial celebration of Passover, which is described in Exodus 12 and 13. Passover, or unleavened bread, by the way, is here's another kind of Mormon connection. There's some times of the year when everyone is supposed to come together, come to the temple, come to Jerusalem, and bring their offerings and also just receive instructions from the priests and stuff. And one of them is in the spring, Passover, which is around April, and one of them is at the Feast of Tabernacles, which is in around October usually. So, although the LDS General Conference, they're around the beginning of April and the beginning of October, they don't always line up with unleavened bread and tabernacles, but there's definitely an echo there. The other time, the third time, when and this is just for the men. Other people, the women are allowed to. There's no restriction there, but the men are required to show up and bring their offering, represent the family, and bring their offerings, like I said, and receive instruction and stuff. The other time is Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks, so which is coming up soon, and you're gonna give us a talk there at the Restoration Torah Conference. We'll talk more about that next time, I guess. But anyway, there's controversy about that. But I am convinced that although there are sacrifices and stuff that were supposed to be done by the Levites and done in the temple, and Joseph Smith himself said someday those things are going to be done again. When again, and Joseph Smith says the same things that the rabbis say, which is when the temple is built, when there's a proper place to do these Aaronic things, that there will be a renewal, at least partly, of the animal sacrifices as part of the restoration of all things. However, when I read Exodus and read about the Passover lamb, there's no Levites involved. It's just the father of every family is supposed to do it. There's no temple involved. You do it at your house. And so we do that. We have a lamb that we've raised. I have one in my backyard right now that's getting bigger by the day, and we'll slaughter and roast that lamb. I built an oven in our backyard, so that'll feed. Well, we usually have something like 60 to 70 people.
Wow. Who
come, and of course we don't only eat the lamb, but we eat the lamb and then eat the bitter herbs and the matzah and the haroset and the glasses of wine and have the Seder, and it's a good experience.
That's awesome. And so when are you doing that this time?
So this year, it's going to be April 5th, the evening of April 5th.
The evening of April 5th.
Yep. will be Passover, the day that the day of Passover, or the day that the lamb is killed, is going to be the 5th. But then as the 5th goes into the evening, after sundown, then that becomes the 15th day of the first month, which then is the first day of unleavened bread, which is when the lamb is supposed to be eaten. So the lamb is killed on the 14th and then eaten with the matzah and the bitter herbs on the 15th, the evening of the 15th.
Wow.
So
it's got to be an emotional experience.
Oh, you can't. I'm definitely not a vegetarian, and I have no problem going to the store, and buying this, processed, bloodless, gutless, hairless, odorless piece of meat, wrapped in styrofoam and plastic wrap or whatever, faceless. But yeah, the first time that I actually slaughtered a lamb for my family to eat, it was hard, and it still is hard. I don't do it that often. I mean, I do it once a year. I didn't know if I could do it the first time, actually. I mean,
right,
but it was surprising, actually. We mentioned that before. Like, I didn't really think about it. I didn't anticipate having a problem. But man, when I went to we cut its throat, to slaughter it. But it took a long time for me to get up the courage, I guess. I don't know if courage is the right word, but just the strength to do it, and then the loss that I felt was just palpable too.
Yeah, and again, I think that's designed for a reason, right?
Yeah.
That's to show you, if you feel this way about an animal, imagine essentially having to offer up your own firstborn who did nothing wrong.
Yeah.
Lived the perfect life.
Yeah. I have my when my kids are young, I don't really, when they're really little, I don't really want them out there watching.
Right.
It's hard to understand. But as soon as they're 8, before that, if they're interested, they can come watch. But after they turn 8, they're required. Like, you have to see what is being done on your behalf. Now you are, now that you're old enough, that you're going to be accountable. You need to understand, and I think that's a powerful image.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah, and I hunted for a long time. I stopped hunting about 5 years ago, and mainly because I got lazy. I'll admit, the last time I woke up in October to a foot of snow up in the mountains, I'm like, yeah.
What are we doing here?
What are we doing? But no matter how many times I went hunting, there's still that twinge. I mean, there's still that feeling. And I think that's healthy.
I think that's good. Yeah, I think it's healthy. Yeah.
I think that's healthy. I think it does two things. You become truly grateful for that animal. You become truly grateful. The idea that this is something anyone would take joy or pleasure in is a silly thing. Now, I'm sure that there are those, and them I would question ever having them around my kids.
Right.
But yeah, so this isn't something that's taken lightly, and I could tell by the way you looked that's something you take pretty seriously, and it weighs on you.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, we usually start. It's kind of an all-day thing. We'll have people show up at the house around noon, and then there's all kinds of preparations. Cutting up vegetables, and we have a big, the kitchen turns into a big matzah making factory. And we basically mix up dough and roll it out flat, and bake it or cook it in pans or things like that. And so we just cook hundreds of pieces of matzah, and people are chopping up vegetables and getting tables set. People are outside, skinning and gutting and roasting the lamb, and so it's kind of a production, and it's an all-day thing, and it's great. So that's what we do to celebrate, basically. And then, of course, we actually just eat matzah the whole week,
Right.
So, yeah, it's good. This year we're actually going to. There's a lady in the ward where I live who has this enormous nativity set collection. So on the evening of the April 5th, we're going to have the Seder and all of that. And then the morning of April 6th, we're going to go look at all these. She's going to set out these nativity sets for us to come and take a look at. So that'll be fun.
That's awesome. Well, dude, that's good stuff.
Yeah. No, one other thing I will say is this first fruits. This, like I said, it's on. I subscribe to the Karaite idea, which is also the Sadducee idea, which is that it's supposed to be on the Sunday during unleavened bread. Okay. So, actually, I just remembered something else I wanted to mention. This is a nice segue into it, but this is Easter. Right. Easter is not always, but almost always the Sunday during
Passover,
the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Yeah.
Feast of Unleavened Bread. Sorry.
Yes, to be precise, which is in common parlance often called Passover, a week of Passover. So that's fine. Now, interesting thing about that though is at the council. I mean, this goes to the Great Apostasy here. We're going to talk about the Great Apostasy a little.
We're going straight to the Nicaea, aren't we?
Yeah. So 325, Council at Nicaea. Constantine is presiding, and one of the big things that they attempt to accomplish here. Well, let me back up here. When Mormons talk about the Great Apostasy, there's a couple of parts to it, right? One is there's like physical persecution, and the apostles are being killed off, and maybe other priesthood leaders, right? So there's this interruption in the transmission of priesthood. And then the other thing that we often talk about is this corrupting influence of pagan Greek pagan and philosophical ideas, corrupting doctrine and things like that. The thing that we don't talk about though is that there was an intentional, and this happened at Nicaea, which was the first council, as far as I know, like the first church council. But one of their goals was, we got to figure out how to get rid of all of this Israelite stuff that is encumbering the church. And we want the church to be non-Israelite as possible. We want to have nothing in common with those detestable Jews. And so we're going to calculate Easter a different. We're not going to rely on the Jewish calendar to calculate Easter, although they basically came up with a different way to calculate it that ends up being equivalent.
Pretty close.
Yeah, but yeah, there was any Jewish bishops, and there were still at this time Jewish bishops. They were all excluded from the council, and they made these decisions to intentionally get rid of Jewish ideas, and one of them was the observance of Passover. This was actually a big part of the apostasy that eventually became Catholicism. Is we need to root out these. These Christians are still observing Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and we do not want them to do that anymore. And we're going to celebrate Easter. And eventually, this turns into egg-laying rabbits, celebrating the resurrection, which is just so weird. But we'd rather have that than anything to do with like Exodus and the symbolism involved there. And there were kind of holdouts, I think, of early Christians who continued to celebrate this up until about 400 AD, when the church is finally able to stamp it out from being practiced in Christianity. So when I look at keeping these feasts and Passover in particular, like, I just consider it as part of the restoration, and this is like pushing back, like undoing the things that were done as part of the apostasy, the great apostasy. So anyway,
that's awesome. I had again, my good buddy whose dad was a rabbi. He told me, because I was really concerned, right? I was thinking, when I was first thinking about, these feasts and that sort of thing, when I lived in Maryland, I was always super nervous because I wouldn't want somebody creeping into the temple who wasn't supposed to be there. Likewise, I didn't want to be that guy creeping in on somebody else's tradition that shouldn't be there. To my surprise, even Joel's dad was like, "No, we welcome it." He's like,
"You want to come join us?"
Yeah. I mean, my first Seder was at his house.
Oh, amazing!
And I was so glad I got to do it. And he explained it. He was like, "No." He's like, "If you're a Christian, if you profess to follow Christ, why wouldn't you do this?" He's like,
"Okay, wow, that's a very
why wouldn't you do this? That was Jesus' religion, was it not?"
Absolutely.
And I was like,
it was.
Yeah, you got a point. So I think sometimes we feel like, well, that's theirs, this is ours, and I think it's, like you were saying, a hangover from the apostasy.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's one more thing I want to bring up, is that Passover is a part of the restoration too, not just keeping the Seder like I do, because we don't really have evidence that Joseph Smith kept a Seder, for example.
Right.
But the imagery of Passover is embedded in the fabric of the restoration. So anciently, we talked about Israel being born as a nation on Passover. That happened again. Passover is the day the church was reestablished. April 6th, 1830. April 6th, 1830 was the 13th of the first month, but the meeting was into the evening. So it was on the 14th. It was on Passover when the church was reestablished in the latter days. Okay, and then there's another interesting thing that's part of the Seder, and this is kind of a mysterious thing, but Mormons will appreciate the symbolism here. Is that there's always this place at the table left for Elijah.
Right.
And it's interesting because there's in the standard works, there's one prophecy that is repeated in all of them, and it's only one prophecy, and that is the great and dreadful day of the Lord, when Elijah will come to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to their fathers. And that's something Elijah, it's one of his missions, and that's repeated in the Bible, the Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price, and the Book of Mormon all have that prophecy repeated. So Mormons will appreciate that too, for that symbolism, and so they'll have the table set, and the family will be sitting around the table, but there will be a gap,
right,
where Elijah's place will be set, and a Mormon looking at that might think about sealing, and like, oh look, when Elijah comes, then that actually completes the family, right? So now that prophecy about the Elijah coming,
that was fulfilled in Kirtland, right?
Yeah. The Old Testament doesn't have a time associated with that, but for some reason, and I don't know the reasons for this, but for some reason that in the Jewish mind has been associated with they were looking for that to occur at Passover time, Feast of Unleavened Bread. And yes, you're right. So April 3rd 18, was it 32? I don't remember now.
I believe it was 32.
Let's see. I can actually
I could be
have it
wrong,
here.
but yeah.
Let me just look it up real quick. But anyway, yeah. Right. The dedication of the Kirtland Temple. Elijah comes. And that's good. Oh, gosh. Well, it doesn't matter. I'm just looking here through the Seder. There's a couple other things I want to mention that are just kind of cool. Here it is. 1836. April 3rd, 1836. Okay. Another big one is that the Passover is when you're slaughtering the lamb, you're not allowed to break any bones. And Jesus fulfilled this too, because when he was crucified, the Roman soldier came to break his legs to make sure that it was done, but decided to poke him with a spear instead, and he was dead already, and so no bones were broken. So this was a fulfillment of that Passover ritual as well. So anyway, amazing stuff. So yeah, so we have those those other fulfillments as part of the restoration. The establishment of the church, the birth of the Latter-day Church, and the visit of Elijah there. So it's pretty cool stuff.
That's awesome. So that book, the
Haggadah,
is that available online somewhere?
You can get them online. This one is one that that my father put together. Actually, he edited and compiled this, and then I've kind of added to it since, and added some extra added recipes to the back and stuff for the matzah and other things. So, but if you'd like a copy, I'll leave this one with you.
Oh, thank you.
I have Kevin Kraut prints these for me.
Oh, does he?
So, if anyone wants a copy of my Haggadah, you just go to Old Pioneer Press in Santa Quinn, Utah, and Kevin Kraut. Look, I've got some Haraset on there that someone spilled.
It's all good.
So
it's all good.
And ask if he'd print you out a copy of Joshua Erickson's
nice
Passover Seder,
and he'll know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah,
dude, I'll tell you what. As we went through these, I'm continually amazed at how many episodes in the restoration historically just continue to land on these days over and over and over.
God is definitely using his calendar still.
Yep, absolutely. Whether we want to admit it or not.
Whether we are aware.
Yep.
Yeah, that is right.
And when I think it also speaks to this idea of there's some responsibility if you're going to call yourself Israel. There are things that are required of you. And even if you think that you don't want to do those things, if you're really committed, you'll find yourself there.
Yeah. Whether
you want to or not.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of the way it is. And yeah, I'm just continually amazed at the precision at which it is all unfolded to stay in lockstep with that. So, and this was the last one of these, right?
No, one more.
What, weeks?
Yeah, Feast of Weeks.
Okay.
Also known as Shavuot, also known as Pentecost.
Nice. Yep. All right. Did we miss anything?
I think else? There's much more that we could talk about as far as details, but this is a good overview. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, well, dude, as always, I appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
You're listening to the Mormon Renegade Podcast.